IVM.
So it's been a great week on IVM, and I hope that you're listening to as many shows as you can. If you're not following us on social media, we're on IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. First, I'm going to tell you about a few new shows that we launched. Last week, we launched a show called Marbles Lost and Found with Zen and Avanti. It's a show about mental health, which I think is a fairly interesting conversation to have, and you should enjoy it. We also have a new fictional fun storytelling show for all of our listeners. Croc Tales by Anand Sivakumaran is a bi-weekly show where Anand spins a story from a prompt that could be a word or phrase coming from you. Catch these episodes every Monday and Thursday. On Simplified this week, the trio dig further into the Football World Cup history with some trivia and silly jokes on a longer episode. On The Scene of the Unseen, Amit Verma is joined by stand-up comedians Aditi Mittal and Abbas Momin to talk about the pros and the cons of the Indian comedy scene. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus does an exit interview with his producer Naveen Narona. Naveen's going to be terribly missed around here. If you're not following him, please follow him on Twitter and Instagram. He's at House of Narona. Try and listen to as many of these shows as you can. And now, on to your show.
Please excuse the subpar quality of the sound in the introductory part of this episode. Once Yazad's interview begins, the quality is fine.
Is a negative right a positive idea?
Why is a right to education problematic, but a right to information perfectly all right?
Welcome to this episode of the Pragati Podcast, where we are discussing negative and positive rights with Yazad Jal.
The Pragati Podcast is a weekly show on economics, policy, and international affairs.
We are your hosts, Pavan, Srinath,
and Hamsini, Hariharan. Before we get into today's discussion on negative and positive rights, we wanted to spend a few minutes responding to questions from listeners.
Dr. Jannavi Kare wrote to us about a scam in the BBMP, yet another one, on dealing with garbage trucks and wanted us to cover that. So, first of all, garbage management in a city, solid waste management is something that is a wicked problem in some ways that a lot of our cities are facing. Here in Bangalore, we've faced enough of this. From garden city to garbage city is the standard rhetoric. So we will definitely get someone local who's an expert to talk about this issue in greater detail. But I just wanted to cover this scam a little bit and give my 2 cents on it. This was from May 2018, just a couple of months ago. And the city of Bangalore, the Bruhat Bengaluru Mahanagara Palike, found out that 100 garbage compactors, those big trucks that you see, just went missing.
What do you mean went missing?
We don't know where they are. They are on the books. So the way it works is, overall in the city, we have about 500 to 600 garbage compactors that serve the entire city.
Okay.
And about 75-80 of them are owned by the corporation.
Okay, the municipal corporation.
Yeah, the municipal corporation, but most of them are owned privately. So the way it works is, you have these garbage clearance contracts that are awarded to various garbage
companies,
right? So to various companies, and it's their job to take garbage away from the city and get it to its destination, whether it's a place where a dump yard, whether it's a waste processing center, whatever. The contract is given for clearance.
Alright.
So these are privately owned compactors, which apparently don't exist anywhere but on paper, but have been drawing fees from the government for quite a while for the garbage that they have supposedly cleared.
So you're saying no truck will come to my house to clear the garbage, but someone is getting paid for it and we aren't sure who.
Yes. So what's happened to me, the bedrock of this is how our contracts are structured in the garbage place. So the problem is most of the times these contracts are transport contracts, right? So the responsibility is to transport garbage from point A to point B, and payment is usually linked to how much garbage arrives at point B. Right? So say you have a landfill. At the gate of a landfill, these garbage trucks go, they get weighed of some sort, or they get paid maybe 500 rupees per tip.
Okay.
So there's a tipping fee that is given. So what that means is it's very skewed. So they're only paid for how many truckloads they tip over. It doesn't matter what's in the truck. It doesn't matter where the truck has come from. And it doesn't matter if the area this truck is supposed to serve is clean. Right? So there is no cleanliness contract. There is no garbage. There is no contract with an incentive to say, I want no black spots in this area. Basically, I don't care how much garbage is created. I want my area to be clean. I want my garbage dump sites to be all right. I want to ensure service, right? So that's what you ideally want in a contract. But the contracts are all about how much garbage you go and dump. So clearly, even in that, there are scams where they don't even dump, but show that these trucks are running the routes. So with that bad contract, there have been all kinds of enforcement mechanisms people have tried. One was people tried to put GPS devices on garbage trucks.
Okay.
So that, a garbage truck that serves Malleshwaram, you can see that, okay, it's actually gone to the Malleshwaram tipping point, spent enough time there to justify the transfer of the load, and then gone to its desired destination, rather than go to a construction dump site, pick up a bunch of mud, and then go to the landfill and dump it there. But funnily enough, what happened in Bangalore is, as soon as these GPS devices were implemented, the garbage truck owners broke all of them.
Oh my God.
This was a while ago, so in the interim, maybe there's been some progress and some devices have actually been fit. But that's the level of the problem. So the garbage contracts are slightly dodgy, but high value. So you have, I think, India's own versions of mafia players who have sort of gotten into some of these contracts. Outcomes don't matter, which is why, you might see that even if you're segregating waste at home and then handing it off, a lot of the time people mix it. Not because they're ignorant, but because they're being told to mix it. Because segregation is the worst thing possible if your contract is about truckloads of material at the dump.
So you have a negative incentive.
Yeah, so if I segregate waste, the amount I need to send outside my house becomes what, 1/10, 1/5 or something. So that's 1/5 the money they would get from dumping truckloads of that garbage in the landfill. So the entire system needs better incentive alignment, and hopefully we'll get someone to talk about that soon.
Yeah, the case of the missing garbage trucks sounds like a great
case of the missing garbage trucks and the ever-present garbage.
All right, thanks, Pavan. We'll be back on the Pragati Podcast after this.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to listen to attempt number 15 to record the promo for the podcast Varta Lab.
Varta Lab.
Varta Lab.
Varta Lab.
Varta Lab.
All day, all night, Varta Lab.
Oh yeah. It's a really nice podcast, guys. It's with me and Naveen, and it has really nice stories.
Yeah, people come tell their stories, ups and downs, fun times. We all cry at the end. It's like a Karan Johar movie, but in 1 hour or less.
Hey.
Yeah, every Monday. Yeah.
Welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. Yazad Jal is a fellow for economic policy at the Takshashila Institution.
He's currently working on how India can start creating 20 million jobs a year.
We had Anupam Manur come and talk on the show about the 20 million jobs target and how many jobs India is creating right now. That's from just 2 episodes ago. You should check it out.
So Yazad is also a libertarian. This is the second libertarian we've had on the Pragati Podcast after our editor Amit Verma.
Hi Yazad, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So Yazad, we are seeing a lot of rights in the Indian discourse. So we got the right to information about 13 years ago. We got the right to education in India maybe a decade ago. And more recently, the Supreme Court read in the right to privacy into our fundamental rights. At the same time, we are seeing a lot of discussions around some folk wanting a right to food, or a right to water, or a right to work. So there are all these discussions around rights. So are all these rights of the same types? Are there any categories of rights that we should be thinking of?
That's actually a very good question. So no, these aren't really all rights of the same kind. And I would categorize rights into negative rights and positive rights. And counterintuitively, the negative rights are the better kind of rights to have. Let me explain it from a very basic principle. The most important right to have is the right to life. Now, what does that mean? It really means that somebody cannot take away that right from you. Somebody can't take away your life. Another important right is the right to property. It means that what's yours, you have, labored for it, or somebody has given it to you. It's your property and nobody else can take it away from you. So those are called negative rights because They are, in a sense, rights that you already have and cannot be taken away from you. The other category of rights are positive rights. Those are rights like, for example, the right to education, which state that somebody has to give that to you. In a way, you can also look at it as negative rights being liberties or freedoms that you have, and positive rights being entitlements, something that you want somebody else to give to you, whether it be the government or somebody else apart from the government. So it's important to see that negative rights, I believe, for example, that negative rights are something that you're born with. The theory is called the theory of natural rights, that you are born with the right to life. You're born with the right to property. You are born with, these inalienable rights in some sense. And in the fundamental rights in the Constitution, in the beginning, we had these sets of freedoms, these inalienable rights, the right to free speech, for example, the right to work anywhere in the country that you wanted to, the right to live anywhere in the country. So these are all negative rights that you were given by the Constitution. And I believe that we had inalienably within ourselves, even before the Constitution gave it to us. Apart from that, what's happened is, both in the Constitution and in the Supreme Court, we've been having a plethora of new rights. And some of them really are nice things to have, but they're not really rights. Now, a right to education is a nice thing to have, but I don't believe it's a right, it's an entitlement. So you can discuss whether it is the government's role to provide education or not, but I don't think that there should be a right to education, that it's not inalienable to you. Of course, you have a right, not to be stopped from having an education, but you don't have a right to be given an education.
Right. So would this be the difference between, say, a right to property and a right to land? For example, where your right to land is, you as a citizen of India have the right to own, an acre of land, and somebody should give that land to you, versus a right to property where nobody can take property that you own away.
That's actually well put, yes. I mean, if you say that the way you mentioned right to land, seems like you have a right to something that's not necessarily yours, that you want somebody to give you an acre of land, versus a right to property is that you already have that piece of property within you. What the government very often does, incidentally, the right to property was in the original set of rights that we had in the Constitution, and was then removed by the Congress government. So we no longer have a right to property.
So someone can take that right away from you.
Unfortunately, yes. So that's the sad part, that the right to property has been taken away from us. I believe it's an inalienable right, and the government actually changed the Constitution to take it out of that.
Okay, the difference between positive and negative rights is, maybe I have a right to practice whatever religion I want or beliefs that I want, whereas the right against discrimination would be that no one should persecute me for whatever belief that I have.
So they're both the same right, actually. When you say you have a right to, freedom of religion, it means you have the right to both practice whatever religion you want to or not practice, and nobody can stop you from practicing that religion that you want to practice. Versus saying that I have a right to food, which means that you're expecting somebody to give you food. Now, it is being mixed with the right to life. And I feel that they are two separate rights. The right to life is, nobody can take away my right to life. Taking away my right to life is murder. Versus a right to food is, somebody has to give me food.
Okay, so we expect the government or society to do lots of things for us, right? For example, give us food, give us water, give us land, whatever it is. So when you say rights are inalienable, it's just that I'm a human and I'm a citizen of this land, so I just have rights because I'm human, or is it because I'm a citizen of this land? Where does my right come from?
So I believe certain natural rights are because we're human. I mean, you don't stop having a right to life if you're not a citizen of the country. It's not like if an American comes to India, he or she doesn't have a right to life. They have that right too. There are other rights that come from being a citizen of the country, like the right to work anywhere in the country is for citizens of India. So if you're a foreigner, you need to apply for a visa to be able to work here. But, to be able to live, you don't require a visa to live. You have that right. It's a natural right within you. Another thing that you pointed out is what the role of government is. And, I believe the most important role of government is to protect negative rights, to protect our liberties. Beyond that, everything else is extra. So protecting the right to life, to making sure that there's a legal setup that, people don't kill each other. Protecting the right to property, which means that, there is a legal setup where people don't rob each other or commit fraud. That's much more important than providing for schools. So I would look at providing schools and setting up an educational infrastructure as being more of an entitlement, more of a privilege than a right.
Just to play devil's advocate, right? If I'm someone who believes, if I'm someone from a very disprivileged state in India, in the sense of I'm extremely poor, I don't have an education, I have no means of recourse. Am I not entitled to something? Doesn't my right to life give me, what use is my right to life if I can't get a good education and I can't get a job because I'm not going to go anywhere?
Good question. And you use the word entitled. So you may be entitled to get an education. So you might argue that the government, one of the roles of the government should be to provide education. But to state that it's a right is a different thing, because what happens with positive rights is that positive rights can be in conflict with each other. Let's take a simple example. Let's say that, you have a right to health care and a right to education. Okay, but they're both positive rights, and you expect the government to give you an education and give you health care. What if the government doesn't have funds for both and can only do one? So those rights are in conflict. While negative rights are not in conflict. You can have both your life and your property. So the government can protect you from being murdered and being robbed, which is what the role of government should be. Now, coming back to your dispossessed person, one, however, thinks that it's only the role of government to do this. There are a lot of non-profit organizations, lots of charity organizations which operate in the sphere of helping poor people. There were a lot of brotherhoods and societies also which would help people of their own community. I know as a Parsi, as a Rashtrian, there is something called the Bombay Parsi Panchayat, which helps poor families gain housing in Bombay. There are, for example, Tamil societies and Kannadiga societies that help their members. So these are other avenues that, we sometimes ignore, and we expect the government to do everything.
So, Yazad, you said that a lot of these rights are natural and inalienable, but there are critiques of that as well, right? So, if you are in the time before the existence of modern states, so if you were a human being in a jungle, right, a metaphorical or a literal jungle, and there is a tiger out there waiting to kill you, do you really have a right to life against that tiger? No, right? Doesn't this right to life come from some sort of a state, a political equation where you say that, look, I'm going to surrender some freedoms that I have. I might surrender the freedom to kill another person. And in return, the state, kingdom, political entity of some sort will protect the rest of my rights.
So you're talking about a social contract.
Sort of a social contract, yes.
In which you give the state the monopoly on violence. The state has a monopoly on violence, and in return, the state protects your other rights.
Right.
Of course, rights don't exist in a jungle because you don't expect the tiger to have rights. But when you're talking about rights, you're talking about it not atomistically, but you're talking about it in relation to a society.
Okay.
So social contract is another way that you can think about rights. That you and I have the same rights, that my freedom to move my hand is limited by my hand not hitting your face.
Right. Fair enough. But often it requires some sort of a state or a government to effectively enforce these rights or sufficiently provide these rights to any population, right? I mean, we see many anarchical examples of where states have collapsed, nobody has a monopoly over violence, and people's fundamental right to life and liberty are badly damaged, right? I mean, we see this in Syria, we see this in Somalia, we see this in South Sudan, we see this in parts of India, right? So don't you need some sort of a state to do this?
Granted, but once again, that does not take away from the fact that the state should protect negative rights and not kind of dole out a plethora of positive rights. So what you're talking about is you need an infrastructure to protect your negative rights. And granted, yes, there are, of course, philosophical debates about, anarcho-capitalist states and all of that, but we won't get into that out here. So you need a state to protect your right to life, to protect your right to property, to protect your freedom of expression, to protect your freedom of religion, and so on. What I'm arguing is that you don't need a state to enforce a right to education. Because when the state does that, what it's basically doing is taking money from one part of the population and providing education to another part of the population. So any act of government has behind it taxation, and taxation is taking money by force. So every time you look at any act of government, you must look at that in the back of your mind. So now, you know that there are certain things that are important for the welfare and well-being of citizens. The first being defense, the second being law and order. Now, going beyond that, okay, you are extending the monopoly of violence more and more and more. So it's important to have a limit on that as well.
So a welfare state, like how India professes to be, often looks at its duty as to also provide positive rights, right, in terms of education or whatever. Would you say that it is the role of, it is not government failure, so it is not up to the state to correct it? That it is societal failure that people don't have education, and therefore it is up to society to correct it and not the government?
So I would think that after protecting our basic rights, after protecting our negative rights to life and property and expression, the thing that the government should do is stay out of the way so that we can become rich. Because as a richer society, as a richer country, it is possible to provide a lot more entitlements than it is to provide if you're a poor country. So then what happens is that we're indulging ourselves in a lot of empty talk. When we say we have the right to education or we have the right to X, Y, and Z, it's doling out these things without having an infrastructure to be able to provide for them. So today we have a right to education in India, but I see lots of children who still aren't getting an education. So what use is that right? And the government is not being able to provide that right to education. So apart from the fact that, it is, giving out largesse that it can't provide for, it is also taking away taxes from people and, increasing taxes to do the same thing. I would rather the government let people get rich first, stay out of the way, let our country progress, and then think about those things.
I mean, to me, the easiest shorthand I have for this is, did we have an information technology industry first or a Ministry of Information Technology? And obviously,
we had the industry first.
The industry first, right? So government usually catches up and creates itself in places where it didn't exist because the industry has gone there or something else has gone there. But Yazad, I wanted to ask a little about... So one of the problems with positive rights is that it costs someone something to provide them. Right?
Yes.
But in the real world, there are costs associated with sort of enforcing and providing negative rights as well, right? So, for example, you need a police force, you need investigative powers and abilities with that police in order to, say, stop murders, or provide a strong deterrent. So you need a good legal system which prosecutes offenders, so that you feel afraid before you think of violating someone else's rights. right?
Correct.
That there are sufficient deterrents for you. So there are still costs involved. It still costs the government something. Maybe in an ideal world, this number could be approximated as friction and therefore nothing. But there's still a lot of money.
Yes, that's true. But then look at it this way. If you had to choose between the right to life and the right to education, which would you choose?
Life wins.
Yes. So it is the government's role, in a sense, to provide protection to its citizens, to provide those negative rights. So that's the very basic. Positive rights are an addition. It's over and above the negative rights. So its entitlements come after you have your basic liberties. So you count the costs of providing or protecting. Actually, I'd use the word protecting. What the government is doing is protecting your liberties and providing you with entitlements.
Fair enough.
So I look at protecting your liberties as far more important than providing entitlements. And yes, there is, of course, a cost to protecting your liberties. But that is the basic role of government. If the government cannot protect your liberties, why do you have a government at all?
Yazad, I think the question becomes a little more complicated when we talk of, say, something like the right to privacy, right? I mean, if I were to reinterpret the Aadhaar and the other privacy-related debates that are happening in the country, people are trading off a right to privacy with an entitlement for development or some sort of an access for greater finances or some other state-related entitlements, right? So there's this discussion happening where people are willing to abridge their right to privacy, give away private information in order to get some sort of a benefit. So how do you see this playing out? I mean, as a society, there are many who have said, oh, privacy is a Western concept. Indians don't understand this right to privacy. And I think that's bunkum. But in general, the societal interest in something like privacy is far more limited in India today than many other places in the world.
You're right about that, but I take objection when you said people are willing to give away their right to privacy. It's not. It's a little more complex than that. It's the government is forcing you to give away your right to privacy in return for something else. When the government insists that Aadhaar has to be there, that you have to take up an Aadhaar and you have to link it to your bank account, what it's doing is not. It's not I doing it out of my own will or my own volition. It's the government forcing me to do it. So there's a big difference out here, and I think it's very important to have the right to privacy. And it's perfectly okay if a citizen chooses himself or herself to give away some of that privacy for certain privileges. That you get an Aadhaar card so that you can get some government privileges. That's fine if you want to. But if you don't want to, you should not be forced to do it. And what's happening right now is that you're being forced to give away as part of your privacy for certain things that you may or may not want. And for certain things that you may already have. I already have a bank account. I don't want to connect it to an Aadhaar card or get an Aadhaar card. And, the genesis behind Aadhaar was so that certain underprivileged parts of the population could get access to certain government programs. Now, if I do not intend to benefit from those government programs, I don't need them, I should not be forced to get an Aadhaar card and, then link it to my bank accounts or link it to my telephone and so on and so forth. So it's not citizens giving up part of their privacy, which I think they should be able to. It's the government forcing you to give up that privacy. That's why the Supreme Court has talked about a right to privacy that kind of limits the government's role in this.
So it's the difference between my signing up for Google services and allowing them to collect data on me versus me being forced to sign up for Aadhaar.
Correct.
Because they'll freeze my bank account or disconnect my SIM card or something else.
Yes. Which, on a personal level, one of my bank accounts is frozen out because of Aadhaar, and I'm fighting the bank for that.
Wow.
But you're right about that. And, a lot of people confuse this. Oh, we give away so much of our information to Google or Facebook. But the difference is we are giving that information out of our own free will because we see some kind of gain being on Facebook or being on Google. We see getting something out of Google and Facebook. Therefore, we're willing to give up some information. We can, as an individual, I should have the right to, decide to give up how much of my privacy if I want to. I know friends who are not on Facebook, who are not on Google because they don't want to give up that privacy. And it is their right to decide how much of their privacy they should give up or not.
Yazad, when we're thinking about negative rights, how do we deal with a problem like slavery? So to me, on the face of it, it looks like you can have the right to life, but you can also have people owning others, right?
No, because the right to life isn't just a right not to be murdered. It's a right to do what you want to do with your life.
Okay.
So as a slave, you don't have the right to work for whom you want to, or not work, or do what you want to with your own life. So when somebody is owning a slave, he's taking away that part of those rights. So slavery is inherently against, a right to self-ownership. So an important part of the right to life is that you own yourself. You own your body. You own the fruits of your labor. So even the right to property, in a sense, comes from that. So as a slave, you don't own your body. It was pretty common for masters to rape slave women. You don't own the fruits of your labor. You're forced to work in the plantation.
Right.
Okay? You can't say no, and you can't leave that job because it's not a job. It's slavery. So in that sense, just because one part of the right to life is granted to you, it does not mean that you actually have the right to life. You don't. You are not owning yourself, which is that basic bedrock of rights, self-ownership.
And in America, something that you mentioned earlier was also that slaves weren't even considered human, so they didn't have a right to life, in a sense, right?
Slaves were considered to be 3/5 of a human being. So when the census was counted, you would count the white man, as one human being per person, and slaves were 3/5 of a human being.
And I think in Hammurabi's times, in the Fertile Crescent, there was this idea of there were no rights per se, but there was a cost associated with killing a man, killing a woman, and killing a slave. And I think
it was much cheaper to kill a slave.
Yes, and there was a similar ratio. So there was an imputed value to a slave's life versus a citizen's life.
But when you have a right to life, what you're saying is that value is infinite.
Right.
There is no money that you can pay to kind of, take. I can't take your life and pay your family a certain amount of money. There is no amount. It's infinity that I can pay your family. So, that's the important part of having a right to life, that you just cannot take somebody's life for whatever reason. We can go into war and all those things separately, but even in war, you can't kill a prisoner of war. Okay, you can say it's self-defense when you're fighting against somebody else and you have to kill that person because otherwise you'd get killed. But that's not abridging that person's right to life.
Right. Same with, you're not allowed to indiscriminately target civilians while fighting a war, right? You're supposed to fight the army on the other side.
That's right.
Thanks, Yazad. We'll just take a short break now.
अगर आपकी जिंदगी में कोई ऐसी आपको दुविधा हो जिसका सवाल कोई दे नहीं पा रहा, तो हमने बनाया है आपके लिए एक खास शो जिसका नाम है सुन लो जी सुरलॉजी, जिस पर मैं पवन कुमार आपका सूत्रधार आपका स्वागत करता हूँ ताकि आप पूछ सके सवाल सोनू से.
Yes, I am Sonu. Hello, pleased to make your meeting. I am a super reality celebrity और दुनिया के कोई भी प्रॉब्लम नहीं है जो सेलिब्रिटी सॉल्व नहीं कर सकते, तो मैं आपके सारे प्रॉब्लम्स का हलाइजेशन एंड सॉल्वाइजेशन कर दूंगा.
तो जी हाँ, सोचिए मत, जरूर सुनिए सुन लो जी सोलॉजी हर बुधवार, दैट इज वेडनेसडे.
प्लीज लाइक आइज, शेयर आइज, कमेंटलाइज. अगर आपके पास कोई भी प्रॉब्लम्स है, सोनू को बताइए. सोनू सारे प्रॉब्लम सॉल्व कर सकता है. इसी तरह तो मैं सुपर सेलिब्रिटी बना हूँ.
Welcome back. So how do rights work when it comes to refugees? Because refugees are still seen as aliens to a land, right? So do you know how in India we look at rights of refugees?
So refugees, of course, still have their right to life. As they're not citizens, they may not have other rights like the right to work or the right to live anywhere. And as a country, we have to decide whether or not we would like to accept refugees and make them citizens. And I think India has had a very good record in that. And it's not just modern India, even ancient India had a record on that. I mean, I belong to a community that left Iran 1300 years ago and came to India as refugees. And the king of Gujarat at that point of time accepted the refugees. So it's a long and illustrious tradition that we have in India.
All right. So you're saying the backlash against refugees in parts of Europe or America is the backlash against providing refugees with positive rights? Is that one way to look at the debate?
Yes. So that very often is the bedrock of it is that very often what happens is that refugees also are given entitlements. And when you're looking at entitlements, it's share of a limited pie. And therefore, citizens think that, if those people are getting, we will be getting less. And that is why, there is a certain amount of resentment towards refugees. But refugees are human beings. They're most probably, escaping from, Syrian refugees are escaping from certain death. So in a sense, it is a humanitarian thing to do. It is, however, very often still an entitlement, still a positive right. The refugees have a basic negative right within them that all of us do, the right to life, the right to self-ownership. Beyond that, it is up to each country to decide, what they would like to give to the refugees, what kind of entitlements or privileges they would like to give to refugees, moving from full citizenship and the entire basket of rights to a certain amount of limited rights, allowing the refugees to stay till their home country is safe again.
So, Yazad, in the politics of rights and especially positive rights, I see a couple of things. One of them is this idea of upselling, right? So, an entitlement still sounds worse than a right. So, if an entitlement is sort of upsold and, upgraded to a right, it sort of seems shinier even if it actually makes no difference to anyone. The other that I see is this seems to be an offshoot of this whole idea of one of social justice and then the social justice movement that's been there recently, and this idea of rights-based development, right? I mean, we saw this especially in the UPA era in India about a decade ago, where we had 9%, 10% economic growth year on year. A lot of people took that for granted and started this whole idea of inclusive growth, where we said that, look, there are all these people who are not included in the growth process, which was partially true, but that was misdiagnosed too. So therefore, if we include them in this growth process by doing some form of redistribution and doing that redistribution in the form of positive rights, then you can get true development in the country, right? So there was this elaborate theory of change of how if we can provide enforceable rights to people on entitlements like education and health and food and other things, then that can be lasting development. Right? I mean, that seems to be a political movement almost, which has resulted in this new language of rights.
It is. Let's go from the very beginning, what you just talked about. Yes, it is much shinier to say rights than entitlements. And, you're packaging it properly. But the packaging doesn't really change what it is. Right. A positive right is an entitlement. So I'm being honest when I'm calling it an entitlement. When people call it, it's a right, they're basically packaging it, making it shinier. So you're right about that. The second thing that you mentioned was social justice. I don't think there's anything called social justice. There is justice. Okay? To make sure that you have the same equality before the law, that, nobody can take away your rights, and so on and so forth. That's justice. Social justice is a fancy term for entitlements once again. Where you expect society, or what you call society, to give you something. Okay, you should expect justice from the government. Social justice is, like a right to education. You want these nice things to happen to you.
Or you want, say, reservation because of historical oppression. Right? Which is still an entitlement provided by the government. We can
Correct.
argue whether it's a good entitlement or a bad entitlement, but it's still an entitlement.
Reservation is one of the really difficult topics because of the history of discrimination, caste discrimination in India. It goes back to, for example, you talked about slavery earlier, on the case for reparations, where do white people in the United States owe former slaves any kind of reparation for taking away, generations of income from them. But moving on from that, talking about growth and being inclusive about growth, one reason why we were able to give certain rights is because we grew at 8 to 10%.
Right.
So I think it's more important to look at that 8 to 10% economic growth. And the government should focus on making sure that it continues on that growth than thinking about redistributing that growth. It's far more important to think about enlarging the pie, making the pie bigger and bigger, than to think about how to divide the pie. Okay? I would want to make the poor richer, not the rich poorer, and equalize. You can equalize in both ways. And very often we're looking at distribution, we're looking at taking money from one part, giving it to the other, without increasing the total amount of money there in the system.
Right.
I would look at increasing the total amount of money and not really care about inequality that much. Again, my focus would be, as a policy analyst or as a policymaker, the focus should be, how do we enhance, how do we make the life of the poorest better? We should ignore what the rich are doing and let them manage the way they want to manage. Focusing on taking money from the rich, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose. Focusing on making the poor richer is the most important thing.
And we find that a lot of time missing negative rights are the reason that a lot
Correct.
of people are trapped in poverty, right?
Correct.
Like if you don't have the right to own the land and use it in the way that you see fit and then sell it to capture its true value, then, you're stuck,
Yes.
right? A farmer can sell farmland only to another farmer for doing farming. So the true value of that land might be to build an industry, to build a house or something else, which the value of that goes entirely to the bureaucrat who gets to change the land use certificate of that land.
It's worse than that. Farmers very often don't have the right to sell their produce to whom they want to. There is something called a minimum support price, or an MSP. So the farmers are forced to sell their produce to the government at an MSP. They don't even have the right to, for example, export their produce if they so want to. So you have farmers are, as a segment of the population, amongst the most oppressed in this country. They don't have basic rights to do what they have to do with their own labor, with their own property, with their own crops that they're growing. So that is a serious, serious abrogation of negative rights. It's like the government, wanting to provide positive rights to one section of the population by having, say, cheaper food. And it's doing that by taking away income from another section of the population. It is not allowing the farmers to get market price for the crops that they grow. So, in a sense, that is one of the great injustices of modern India.
Yazad, I have something that's on my mind since we're talking about positive liberties. Women for a very long time had to fight for the right to vote, right? I remember reading that countries like Switzerland gave women the right to vote in the 1970s. And so would you say the right to vote is a positive liberty?
It's a liberty, yes. It's a negative right, because that is the right to be able to choose your own government. So you have the right, not to be ruled by a monarch. In a sense, I feel that the right to be able to choose your government is an important right. And it's part of that is the right to vote. Whether you vote or not is a different story. You can exercise your right by not voting. In the same way, you can exercise your right to property by not having any property. But it was a great injustice to women that they were not given equal rights as men were. And it's been a historical injustice that, only recently has, in some way been, rectified. And there are certain countries, I think, still that, where women have limited rights and not the same rights as men. So I think, one, that the right to vote is an important negative right because it gives you the right to choose your government. And two, women should have exactly the same rights as everybody else because women are just as human as men are. And, talking about women's rights, we have to talk about women's rights because women weren't given those rights. I look forward to a world where we don't talk about women's rights because they're human rights after all. And we talk about all human rights as one.
So if we're going to extend that argument to homosexual people or transsexual people or the entire LGBTQ scale, would you say that what they're fighting for, whether it's in terms of recognition or the right to marry someone, would those also be negative rights?
Yes. Once again, they're as human as you and me. And there is nothing that separates somebody who is gay or lesbian or transgender from me. And they should have exactly the same rights as me. They should have exactly the same privilege. Marriage, incidentally, is not a right, it's a privilege. What you have is the government is giving you a shortcut contract. So if the government is allowing, a man and a woman to enter into a shortcut contract, it should not stop a man and a man from entering into the same shortcut contract, or a woman and a woman entering in the same contract. So I think it is in some way limiting rights, which should not happen. People of the LGBTQ persuasion should have exactly the same rights as we should. I mean, when I say we, I don't even want to say there's an us and a them. We're part of the same we. They're as Indian, as human as I am, and they should have exactly the same rights as I do. I mean, there should be no debate on this, actually. And I think the fact that we're having a debate on this tells us how far we still have to go in terms of rights.
Right. And things like Section 377 come in the way of what two consenting adults do in the privacy of their bedroom, which sounds ridiculous. I mean, get the government out of my bedroom.
Correct. Get the government out of my life, in a sense. What two consenting adults want to do with their life is up to them.
So, Yazad, we'll sort of come back a full loop here, and I want to talk about a right that we have in India that is linked to the government, and this is the right to information. How would you classify this beast? Is it a positive right, negative right? Is it something else altogether?
So there's a good amount of debate on that, and at one point of time I thought this was a positive right because we are asking the government to give you something, to give you information. Recently I have been persuaded that it's actually not. It's more of a negative right, and the way I look at it is now is that, after all, the government is supposed to be telling us certain things. The government is supposed to be giving the information out because it's our government. And asking for that information is a negative right. We're asking for stuff that we should anyway know. It's keeping aside, secrets, for reasons of defense. Apart from that, the internal workings of the government should not be a secret to us. How a government works should be open and should be given to the people as a matter of course. Therefore, I think that the right to information today is a negative right. It's a right that we all have because it's our government. We choose the government. We give it, that exclusivity of violence. And therefore, we should have the right to know what the government is doing because it's doing it in our name.
And it's also, if you look at it, our resources, our
Correct.
Information.
Yes, it is our information and it is our resources. You're 100% right in that, Hamsini.
So it's almost, to me, there's a parallel to right to property almost, right? That this government is sort of a government that works for us,
yes,
or an agent of the citizens of the country.
Yes.
And I need a right to access my own information.
Yes.
Right?
Actually, you've put it very well. We're the principals. As citizens, we're the principals. The government is our agent. And we have the right to know what information that the government has because it is, after all, our information.
Okay. So on that note, thank you so much for joining us today, Yazad.
Thank you so much, Pavan.
You.
Thank you, Hamsini.
Thank you, Yazad.
And with that, we're done with today's episode.
If you have comments or questions for Yazad or for either of us, write into podcast@thinkpragati.com.
If you head over to thinkpragati.com, you can also read more about public policy in India and how it affects the entire world.
Also, check out the articles on express.thinkpragati.com for stuff on rights and liberties.
The Pragati Podcast is available on the IBM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts from. We are there everywhere.
As you can see, we have a podcast listener in his natural habitat. Millions of years of evolution have led him to this point. He's on his way to work, and listening to podcasts makes his miserable day better. He will now head to work and use all his knowledge to communicate with other colleagues and possibly future mates. You can find more of his species on ivmpodcasts.com, your one-stop destination where you can check out all the coolest Indian podcasts. Happy listening.